The classified ad had been running in the Mystic Weekly for 3 months straight. $80,000 a year for a private driver position at the Whitmore estate. Nobody wanted it. Samuel Carter stared at the crumpled newspaper in his callous hands, the weight of unpaid bills crushing his shoulders. His thumb hovered over his phone before finally pressing call. When the elderly voice answered, Samuel didn't know he was about to step through a door that would change everything. Sometimes the jobs nobody wants become the ones that save your life. Samuel Carter, at 35 years old, felt the persistent ache of desperation in his bones. He was a single father, a man whose hands bore the marks of years spent working with tools and hauling boxes, but whose eyes held a weary gentleness. He lived with his 7-year-old daughter, Grace, in a small apartment in the rougher part of Mystic, a town that seemed to know nothing but the quiet struggle of its inhabitants. Grace, with her strawberry blonde hair and a quiet solemnity that was too old for her years, had not truly smiled since her mother, Laura, passed away 6 months prior. The apartment itself was a testament to Samuel's losing battle against decay. Paint peeled from the ceiling like old skin. The heating system groaned with temperamental inefficiency, and a kitchen window steadfastly refused to close properly against the New England chill. Every night, Samuel could hear the soft, mournful cries of his neighbor, Mrs. Harrison, through the thin walls, a somber symphony of shared loss that echoed his own. The memory of Laura, vibrant and full of life, was a constant, bittersweet companion. Her laughter could fill a room, her spirit infectious. Now, only the ghost of her memory lingered, sometimes manifesting in Grace's innocent habit of setting an extra place at their tiny kitchen table each morning. The medical bills from Laura's long, agonizing battle with pancreatic cancer had swallowed every cent Samuel had, forcing him to sell what little they owned. The funeral costs had been a final, crushing blow. He worked 2 part-time jobs, patching together shifts at a local warehouse and doing odd repair jobs for neighbors. But the relentless tide of expenses always pulled faster than he could swim. Just yesterday, an eviction notice, stark and unforgiving, had been taped to their apartment door, a stark reminder of their precarious existence. Samuel had torn it down, his hands shaking not with anger, but with a profound, bone-deep fear. He could not fail Grace. He simply could not. He thought of her small, hunched shoulders as she walked into school each morning, her backpack seeming too heavy for her slender frame, carrying not just books, but the weight of a silent grief. Grace, who used to chatter incessantly about her day, had become a quiet observer, her voice rarely heard in class, her boundless energy replaced by a contemplative stillness. The $80,000 a year promised by the Whitmore estate advertisement was more than Samuel had ever made in his life, a lifeline dangling just out of reach. It offered the tantalizing possibility of stability, of warmth, of food that wasn't chosen based on its discount sticker. Yet, the persistent fact that nobody wanted it gnawed at him. Such a generous offer in a town desperate for work always carried an unspoken, unsettling condition. But as he looked at the eviction notice, and then at a faded photograph of Grace and Laura smiling by a sunlit river, Samuel knew he had no choice left. His thumb, rough from manual labor, hovered over the numbers on the paper, a moment heavy with resignation and a sliver of desperate hope, before he finally pressed call. The telephone rang once, twice, before an elderly voice, crisp and formal, yet with a hint of fatigue, answered. It was Arthur, the butler. Samuel, gripping the phone, described his background, his driving experience, omitting the desperate circumstances that had led him to this call. Arthur listened patiently, asking only a few perfunctory questions before inviting Samuel to the estate for an interview that very afternoon. As Samuel hung up, a strange mix of apprehension and faint relief washed over him. He was about to step through a door into a world he knew nothing about, a world that promised to change everything, for better or for worse. He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that it would be for the better. The Whitmore mansion rose from the rugged Connecticut coastline like a Gothic monument to loneliness. Its dark stone facade, brooding under an overcast October sky. Samuel parked his rusted sedan outside the wrought iron gates, watching the thick, damp fog roll lazily through the ancient archways, a silent, swirling presence. The estate sprawled across 15 acres of meticulously manicured grounds, formal gardens and ancient trees disappearing into the misty distance. Yet, despite its grandeur and vastness, something about it felt profoundly abandoned, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of silence, hushed whispers, and unspoken sorrows. It was not just quiet, it felt as though the entire structure was holding its breath, a prisoner of its own formidable beauty. Arthur, the butler, stood waiting at the main entrance, a tall, slender figure framed against the imposing oak doors. The man had to be in his early 70s, his posture ramrod straight, his formal bearing softened by eyes that held a peculiar blend of warning and profound sympathy. He greeted Samuel with a polite, almost reverent nod. "Mr. Carter," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the pervasive quiet. "She's been waiting." The words hung in the damp air, carrying a weight that Samuel could not yet decipher, but instinctively understood was significant. The cavernous foyer swallowed sound. Samuel's worn boots, usually loud and purposeful, seemed to disappear on the gleaming Italian marble floor, their soft thuds absorbed by the vaulted ceiling. Heavy velvet drapes, rich with the patina of age, hung in vast folds, filtering the dim autumn light into muted tones. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their gazes fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, adding to the pervasive sense of being an outsider in a deeply private world. The air tasted of old money, and something far older and more potent. The lingering essence of pervasive grief. Arthur led Samuel through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, each one lined with closed, imposing doors. They passed rooms draped in white sheets, covering furniture like ghosts of a life once vibrantly lived, now merely preserved in cold, sterile silence. The house was not merely quiet, it vibrated with a palpable stillness, a profound absence that spoke volumes. Finally, Arthur paused before a study door, rapping lightly before pushing it open. Margaret Whitmore stood with her back to them, a solitary figure facing tall windows that overlooked the turbulent, gray Atlantic. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Samuel's monthly rent, its severe lines echoing her own rigid posture. Her silver-streaked hair, a formidable cascade of elegance, was pulled back into a severe bun, allowing not a single strand to escape. When she turned, Samuel found himself caught, a sharp intake of breath snagged in his throat. She was beautiful, he realized, in the same way that winter storms are beautiful. Sharp, distant, powerful, and potentially devastating. Her eyes, the color of slate, carried a profound, unyielding weight, a burden of sorrow that Samuel recognized instantly. It was the same crushing weight he saw in his own reflection every morning, a mirror of deep, personal loss. "You need this job," she said, her voice unexpectedly rough at the edges, as if unused to prolonged conversation. It was not a question, but a stark, undeniable statement of fact. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, piercing through Samuel's carefully constructed composure. "I need someone who won't ask questions." Her words offered little comfort, only a stark outline of the job's true, unspoken requirement. She moved past him without another word, leaving behind the faint, expensive scent of her perfume, and something else. Something almost metallic, like the taste of suppressed tears, clinging to the air. Arthur watched her go, an expression of profound sadness deepening the lines around his eyes, before turning to Samuel. 8:30 every morning, Mr. Carter, without fail. Arthur began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You will drive her to 4 distinct locations. She will remain at each location for exactly 30 minutes. Never more, never less. She will not speak to you. She will not explain her reasons. But she needs someone reliable. Arthur paused then, his gaze sweeping over Samuel's worn jacket and the subtle, habitual slump of defeat in his shoulders, a silent acknowledgement of the hardship Samuel carried. Someone who understands that sometimes silence is all we have left. Samuel thought of Grace, of her own heartbreaking silence, and nodded. This was a job he had to take. The first weeks passed for Samuel in a relentless blur of routine, a monotonous rhythm that felt less like living and more like drowning in slow motion. Each morning, he would carefully drop Grace at her elementary school, his heart aching as he watched her small figure walk through the gates. Her little shoulders would be hunched, a protective curve against the unseen burdens she carried, her backpack seeming far too heavy for her small frame. She had stopped talking about her mother 3 months after the funeral. A sudden, stark silence that was more terrifying than any outburst. But Samuel knew, with the fierce certainty of a grieving father, that she still reserved a place for Laura at their tiny kitchen table, a silent act of remembrance that tore at his soul. The therapist, a kind woman with gentle eyes, had assured him it was normal, a common stage of childhood grief. But nothing about their fractured life felt normal anymore. His apartment, now more than ever, seemed to be actively falling apart around them, the peeling paint on the kitchen walls a grim metaphor for their unraveling world, the temperamental heating a constant source of anxiety during the chill of autumn. The thin walls allowed him to hear every soft sob from Mrs. Harrison next door, a somber echo of his own silent mourning. The entire building, it seemed, was populated by individuals nursing deep, unhealing wounds. At precisely 8:30 each morning, Samuel would pull the sleek black town car around to the mansion's imposing front entrance. Margaret Whitmore would emerge exactly on time, a figure of impeccable composure, dressed in a fresh, exquisitely tailored suit, her face a mask that never cracked, never hinted at the turmoil within. She would slide into the back seat without a word of acknowledgement. A silent phantom, a folded piece of paper, always crisp and pristine, would be placed on the seat beside him, its elegant script detailing the day's 4 strange destinations. The stops never varied, their purpose a mystifying ritual. First, always, Mystic General Hospital, where she would sit in the parking lot for precisely 30 minutes, her gaze fixed on the pediatric wing. A silent vigil. Then to Pfizer, Hartley and Associates, a formidable law firm downtown, where she would disappear inside for the allotted time, only to return with eyes that were subtly, tellingly red-rimmed. The third stop was invariably the abandoned lot on Riverside Drive, where the skeletal foundation of a house stood like broken teeth against the sky. She would stand there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, a solitary figure in a landscape of forgotten dreams, until the 30 minutes expired, with unyielding precision. The final stop was always Connecticut Mutual Bank, where she would conduct her business with the practiced, almost frantic efficiency of someone constantly running from something unseen. Samuel learned to navigate her profound silence like a ship through a dense fog, relying on instinct and keen observation. He watched her constantly in the rearview mirror, noting the white-knuckled grip on her expensive purse, the way her breath would catch sharply when they passed certain, indistinct streets, how she would suddenly close her eyes when the wailing sirens of an ambulance pierced the air. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to understand that Margaret Whitmore was not merely cold. She was utterly frozen, trapped within an impenetrable ice of her own making, a prisoner of an overwhelming, unarticulated grief. The silence in the car became its own oppressive language. At first, it was suffocating, pressing against Samuel's chest like a physical weight, thick and unyielding. Margaret would sit rigidly in the back seat, her posture unbending, her elegant hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was always fixed on something beyond the window, an invisible point that only she could see. A landscape of memory and regret. Samuel often found himself instinctively matching his breathing to hers, slowing and measuring each inhale and exhale, as if they were both engaged in a delicate, dangerous dance, desperately trying not to disturb something profoundly fragile and on the verge of shattering. By the fourth week, the very quality of that silence began to subtly change. It was no longer merely the absence of sound, but rather the palpable presence of a burgeoning, unspoken understanding. When Margaret's breathing would quicken imperceptibly at the hospital, a subtle tremor betraying her internal anguish, Samuel would instinctively take a slightly longer, more circuitous route to the law firm, allowing her precious extra minutes to compose herself, to reassemble her shattered mask of composure.
When her hands would tremble noticeably after their visits to the desolate empty lot, he would, without a word or a question, gently adjust the car's heating system, a small, unacknowledged gesture of comfort. These small, almost imperceptible kindnesses, these quiet acts of shared empathy, went unacknowledged by Margaret, yet they were not, Samuel realized, unnoticed. He could discern it in the subtle ways her shoulders would relax, just slightly, the rigid tension easing from her frame. He saw it in the fleeting moments when she would sometimes meet his eyes in the rearview mirror for a mere fraction of a second, a silent, almost desperate plea for connection, before her gaze would quickly, reflexively, dart away. There were moments, suspended in the enclosed space of the car, when the sheer, overwhelming weight of their combined grief seemed to fill the very air around them like rising water, threatening to drown them both in its silent, crushing embrace.
Samuel would find his thoughts drifting back to Laura, to the vibrant memory of her infectious laugh that could effortlessly fill any room, to the vivid image of her dancing in their tiny kitchen while making breakfast, a joyful, carefree spirit. Margaret, though entirely unaware of the specific tenor of his internal thoughts, would sometimes, perhaps sensing the deep current of shared sorrow, let out a breath that sounded disturbingly like a sob, cut tragically short. They were, in essence, two profound strangers, sharing the intimate, confined space of a car smaller than most people's bathrooms. Yet, somehow, in that shared crucible of unspoken pain, it felt as though they were the only two people in the entire world who truly understood this particular, agonizing flavor of profound, inconsolable loss. Arthur, the aging butler, also began to offer his own quiet acts of recognition. In the mornings, Samuel would often find a thermos of good coffee, rich and fragrant, waiting for him. A stark contrast to the bitter instant blend he was accustomed to. Sometimes, a sandwich, carefully wrapped in wax paper and filled with ingredients Samuel couldn't pronounce, would appear alongside it. These small, thoughtful gestures felt like messages in bottles, cast into the vast ocean of grief that filled the estate. They were subtle acknowledgments that Samuel was seen, that his quiet, empathetic presence truly mattered in this house of profound shadows, a silent beacon in the pervasive gloom. One afternoon, the delicate balance of their unspoken routine was disrupted. Grace, usually so stoic at school, had called the nurse, claiming a sudden, inexplicable illness. Samuel had to pick her up early, and with no one available to watch her, he found himself with no other choice but to bring her along for Margaret's afternoon rounds. Grace sat in the front seat, silent and unusually pale, her strawberry blonde hair hanging like a protective curtain around her delicate face.
When Margaret emerged from the imposing house and saw the small child in the car, she stopped abruptly. For a fleeting moment, something profound flickered across her face, not anger, but a pain so raw, so deep, that Samuel almost instinctively looked away, unable to bear witness to such unvarnished anguish.
Margaret got into the car without a single comment, maintaining her outward mask of composure. However, Samuel noticed, in the subtle reflection of the window, that her gaze kept returning to Grace, a silent, unblinking observation. At each of their usual stops, Grace would retreat into her small notebook, her pencil moving in quick, nervous strokes, creating a private world on paper. When they reached the desolate, empty lot, a place usually steeped in Margaret's oppressive silence, Grace suddenly spoke, her voice small but surprisingly clear, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. My mom liked empty spaces. She said they were full of possibilities. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the loudest sound she had made in weeks. A fragile gasp that pierced the oppressive quiet.
The rain came down sudden and hard that Tuesday, transforming the late October afternoon into a premature, brooding night. They were parked outside the hospital, the relentless water cascading down the windshield in sheets, blurring the world outside, when Samuel finally broke their long, unspoken agreement. "Do you ever just want to talk?" The words escaped before he could stop them, hanging in the humid air like a fragile challenge, poised to shatter or to connect.
Margaret remained quiet for so long that Samuel began to mentally compose an apology, a retraction of his bold intrusion. Then, barely audible over the drumming rain, her voice emerged. "I'm not used to talking anymore."
"Neither is Grace," Samuel replied, glancing instinctively at the empty passenger seat where his daughter had sat just the week before. "Her teacher says she hasn't spoken in class since the start of the school year." The shared burden of their children's silence formed an immediate, profound bridge. "How did she die?" Margaret asked, the question direct and unexpected, shattering another layer of their guarded interaction.
Samuel realized, with a jolt, that this was the very first personal question either of them had ever asked the other. "Cancer," he began, his voice thick with unshed grief. "Pancreatic. 6 months from diagnosis to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The memory too raw, too painful. Grace was with her at the end. "Laura made me promise to let her say goodbye. I don't know if that was right or wrong." "There is no right or wrong with grief," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly gentle, infused with a newfound, shared understanding. "There's only surviving it, or not." They sat in silence again, but it was profoundly different now, softer, warmer, like sharing a worn, comforting blanket on a cold night. Margaret's hand moved slightly on the leather seat, not reaching for anything. Just an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the immense weight of what had just been shared between them. "The pediatric ward," she said finally, her voice thin with memory. "My son was there for 3 days before." She stopped, shaking her head, the unspoken horror too immense to articulate. "I come here to punish myself. 30 minutes, no more, no less. Like a prescription." Samuel wanted to tell her, desperately, that punishment wasn't medicine, that it offered no solace, no healing. But who was he to talk? He punished himself every single day with endless what-ifs and gnawing should-haves, replaying the past in an agonizing loop. Instead, he simply said, "Grace punishes herself with silence. I punish myself with working. Maybe we're all just trying to control something. In a world that proved we control nothing." Margaret leaned forward slightly in the back seat. And for the very first time, Samuel saw her really look at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. Not through him or past him, but truly at him. "Your daughter," she asked, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Does she like to draw?" "It's the only thing that seems to help," Samuel admitted, a faint flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "But we can't afford—" Margaret's stark reply cut him off. "Art supplies are expensive." She said nothing more that day, maintaining her cryptic silence for the rest of their drive. But something profound had shifted between them, like tectonic plates moving deep underground, an almost imperceptible tremor that heralded the quiet, inevitable beginning of profound change. The heavy ice around Margaret Whitmore was finally, slowly, beginning to thaw. The art supply store on Main Street was the kind of place Samuel had walked past 100 times over the years, a vibrant kaleidoscope of colors and textures, but had never once dared to enter. Its window displays showcased an array of professional palettes, exquisite brushes, and canvases that seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a realm where people possessed abundant time and ample money for the luxurious pursuit of hobbies. But Grace had been particularly withdrawn that week, her silence deeper, more impenetrable, and Samuel found himself standing outside the tempting shop, mentally calculating whether he could skip lunches for an entire month just to afford a basic set of watercolors for his daughter. The choice was agonizing, a familiar tug-of-war between his desperate financial reality and his fierce desire to alleviate Grace's profound sadness. Margaret emerged from the bank earlier than usual that day, her movements as precise and efficient as ever. However, instead of immediately getting into the waiting town car, she paused, standing beside it, her gaze fixed on Samuel. "There's an errand," she announced, her voice, though still reserved, holding the most words she had spoken unprompted in weeks. She directed him, without further explanation, to the art store.
When Samuel parked the car outside, she unexpectedly gestured for him to follow her inside, a silent command that brooked no argument. The shop, once a forbidden world, now enveloped Samuel in its heady scent of paper and oil paints, a palpable aroma of possibility.
Margaret moved through the aisles with a surprising, almost urgent purpose, her steps light and deliberate. Her discerning eye scanned the myriad options, selecting items with the effortless efficiency of someone who intimately understood quality, who knew the precise value of precision. She chose a professional watercolor set, its colors rich and vibrant, brushes that felt like silk against Samuel's rough fingertips, and paper thick enough to hold not just pigment, but dreams.
The grand total, spoken softly by the cashier, made Samuel's stomach clench in a familiar spasm of financial anxiety. But Margaret, without the slightest hesitation or change in expression, simply handed over her credit card. "For your daughter," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through Samuel's internal protest. Children shouldn't be punished for their grief. That evening, when Samuel presented the unexpected bounty of art supplies to Grace, her eyes widened, filling with the first genuine emotion he had seen in weeks, a spark of wonder igniting in their depths. She opened the pristine box with trembling hands, her small fingers reverently tracing the vibrant, untouched colors as if they were precious, fragile stones. Then, she looked up at him, tears, quiet and insistent, streaming down her face. Her voice, a fragile whisper that held the longest sentence she had spoken since her mother's funeral, emerged. "Mom said sad colors make the happy ones brighter. She said that's why rainy days make sunny ones feel special." Samuel pulled her close, feeling her small body shake with suppressed sobs, a release of emotion long overdue. Over her head, he saw the first painting she had done after Laura's death, a stark, gray landscape punctuated by a single, brilliant yellow flower, a beacon of defiant hope. He understood then, with a profound clarity, that Grace hadn't stopped feeling. She had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right tools to express the depth of what words could not possibly capture. The next morning, Margaret noticed the subtle smudge of paint under Grace's fingernails when Samuel once again brought his daughter along for the drive. It was another sick day, one that the school nurse had, perhaps out of a newfound understanding, stopped questioning. This time, Margaret didn't simply watch Grace through the detached reflection of the car's window. Instead, she turned slightly in the back seat, her body language subtly shifting, openly observing the girl's careful, meticulous sketches. "May I see?" Margaret asked, her voice imbued with a gentle curiosity Samuel hadn't heard before, a soft invitation. Grace hesitated for a moment, then, with a shy nod, held up her notebook. The drawing depicted two small figures sitting in a car, rain cascading down the windows, but inside the car, the entire space was filled with a radiant, golden light. Margaret studied the drawing for a long, silent moment, her slate-colored eyes absorbing every detail. Then she spoke, her voice still quiet, but now resonating with a deeper connection. "You see light where others might only see storms. That's a gift." Grace, emboldened by Margaret's sincere admiration, offered a small, tentative smile, fragile, yet unmistakably real. "My mom taught me to look for it," she whispered.
"Your mother was wise." Margaret replied, and Samuel heard in her voice a distinct crack, like ice beginning to thaw, a deep-seated emotion finally breaking through. That afternoon, at the desolate, empty lot, Margaret stood in her usual spot, a solitary figure amidst the crumbling foundation. But this time, she spoke, her voice laced with a raw, long-buried pain. This was supposed to be Michael's house. She touched the crumbling foundation with one gloved hand, her fingers tracing the rough edges. My son. He was going to build it when he got clean. Her voice caught, a fragile tremor. He never got clean. Samuel wanted desperately to offer comfort, to fill the gaping void of her unspoken agony, but he knew, with the certainty of his own grief, how hollow and inadequate words could be. Instead, he simply stood beside her, his own shadow merging with hers on the broken concrete, a silent, empathetic presence. Grace, who had followed unbidden from the car, knelt and placed a small painted stone on the foundation, a habit Laura had taught her. A gentle act of leaving beauty in broken places. Margaret picked up the stone, studying the tiny rainbow Grace had painted on its surface. How old was he? She asked. Her voice barely a whisper. 24. Margaret replied, the number heavy as a tombstone, laden with unspeakable sorrow. He was 24, and I was so busy building empires that I didn't see him crumbling. They ate dinner together that night. The very first time Margaret had invited Samuel and Grace to stay at the mansion. The expansive kitchen, which Arthur, with a hint of melancholy, revealed hadn't been used for a proper meal in 2 years, now came alive with an unfamiliar warmth and the savory, comforting aroma of Samuel's legendary pot roast.
Grace, emboldened by Margaret's genuine interest in her art, had brought her new watercolors and was absorbed in painting at the massive oak table, while the adults conversed in quiet, measured tones. Michael loved to draw too, Margaret said, watching Grace's focused concentration, a wistful note in her voice. Architecture mostly. He wanted to design homes for families, places where people could be happy. Her voice caught again, a raw, poignant tremor.
He said our house was too big for happiness to find its way in. Arthur, who had been a silent, unobtrusive presence until now, placed a gentle, comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of profound empathy. He was happy here once, ma'am, Arthur murmured softly. When he was young. This house has seen joy. Margaret's voice was suddenly bitter, laced with deep-seated regret. Before I drove his father away with my ambition, before I chose board meetings over baseball games, I built a real estate empire and lost my family. What kind of success is that? Samuel thought about his own failures, the endless overtime shifts that had meant countless missed bedtime stories, the pervasive exhaustion that had sometimes made him short-tempered with Laura when she was so desperately ill. We all have regrets, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The question is whether we let them bury us or teach us. Grace, sensing the somber turn of the conversation, looked up from her painting, her young eyes wise beyond her years. Mom said broken things can be beautiful, like in Japan, where they fix cracks with gold. Kinugi, Margaret whispered, staring intently at the child, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. The art of precious scars. A profound realization seemed to dawn on her face. Can you show me? Grace asked, her small voice earnest. And something in Margaret's carefully constructed expression transformed, a dawning hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still offer something valuable to the world, that her brokenness was not an ending, but a new beginning. The following week, Margaret brought a broken ceramic bowl, its pieces held together precariously, and a specialized kit she had ordered directly from Japan. As the town car navigated its familiar ritualistic stops, Margaret, with newfound patience, taught Grace about the intricate art of kinugi in the back seat, their heads bent together in quiet concentration, over the fractured pieces. Samuel watched them in the rearview mirror, observing Margaret's once cold hands so accustomed to signing formidable contracts and building impenetrable walls, now gently guiding Grace's small fingers, showing her how to meticulously trace the cracks with shimmering gold lacquer. The bowl was never perfect to begin with, Margaret explained softly, her voice now remarkably tender. Nothing is. But when we acknowledge the breaks, when we choose to fill them with something precious, we create a new kind of beauty, one that tells a powerful story of endurance and repair. Like people, Grace said, her young voice imbued with deep understanding, her focus unwavering on her delicate work. We all have cracks.
Margaret's eyes met Samuel's in the rearview mirror, a silent, profound acknowledgement of their shared human brokenness and the beauty of resilience. Yes, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Like people. As November arrived, ushering in shorter days and the long, lengthening shadows of winter, their strange, unconventional trio had developed its own comfortable, unspoken rhythm.
Grace now came along on days when school felt too heavy, a welcomed presence, and Margaret had entirely stopped pretending not to expect her. Arthur, with a quiet, knowing smile, began packing lunches for three, a silent affirmation of their nascent, unconventional family. The profound silence in the car had transformed into something truly comfortable, punctuated now by Grace's innocent observations and Margaret's own gradually loosening reserve, her words emerging with increasing frequency and genuine emotion. However, Samuel had begun to notice a more insidious kind of breaking on their drives through the older parts of Mystic, particularly in the vibrant Hispanic neighborhood near the waterfront. Eviction notices, stark and unforgiving, were multiplying like a relentless cancer on apartment doors, grim harbingers of displacement. He recognized families from Grace's school, their faces etched with despair, as they loaded their meager possessions into rental trucks. The vibrant community garden, where Laura used to take Grace to plant tomatoes and teach her about the cycles of life, had been brutally bulldozed, its fertile soil now scarred earth. A stark sign announced the future site of Whitmore Tower's luxury waterfront living, a chilling testament to Margaret's detached empire building. Samuel had, for weeks, kept a tight rein on his tongue, telling himself it wasn't his business, that he was merely an employee. But when he saw Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman who had selflessly babysat Grace during Laura's agonizing chemotherapy, crying uncontrollably outside her apartment with an eviction notice clutched in her weathered hands, something inside him snapped. A profound, moral breaking point. The next morning, the silence in the car felt profoundly different. No longer comfortable, but charged, heavy, like the air before lightning strikes. Margaret noticed. Of course, she noticed. She had become so acutely attuned to the subtle rhythms of their shared space, to every unspoken nuance. "Something's wrong," she stated, her voice devoid of question. A quiet observation that demanded truth. Samuel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel, his knuckles white.
"Do you know Mrs. Rodriguez?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. "She lives on Wharf Street," Margaret replied, her reflection in the rearview mirror going very still, a subtle tremor betraying her composure. Or she did. Samuel's voice grew harder, the raw edge of his pain and anger now unmistakable. "She watched Grace when my wife was dying. She'd make her arroz con leche and sing old songs from Puerto Rico. Grace didn't understand the words, but she understood the love. Yesterday, she was evicted. Your company's name was on the notice. The silence that followed was unlike any of their previous silences. This one had teeth, sharp and unyielding. "I don't handle the residential division personally," Margaret began, her voice cautious, a reflex of corporate defense. "You're destroying lives," Samuel interrupted, his words erupting from months of suppressed frustration, a torrent of righteous anger.
"These aren't just properties, they're homes, they're communities. Mrs. Rodriguez has lived there for 30 years. Her whole life is in that neighborhood. It's business, Margaret countered, but her voice now lacked conviction, the usual corporate steel replaced by an unsettling fragility. Is it? Samuel pulled the car over abruptly, something he had never done before, the sudden stop jarring the heavy silence. He turned in his seat to face her directly, his gaze unwavering, challenging.
You sit outside that hospital punishing yourself for not seeing your son's pain. How can you not see the pain you're causing now? Margaret's face went from stark white to a deep, mortified red. How dare you? She gasped, her voice raw with affront. I dare because I've watched you for months, trying to make amends with ghosts while creating more ghosts for other people. Samuel's voice finally broke, raw with emotion. You want to honor Michael's memory? He wanted to build homes for families.
You're tearing them apart. Grace, who had been shrinking into her seat, suddenly spoke up, her small voice cutting through the adults' intense exchange. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me that home isn't just walls, it's where your memories live. Margaret looked at the child, then at Samuel, and something in her carefully constructed armor finally, irrevocably shattered. She put her face in her hands and wept, harsh, ugly sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long buried. A lifetime of suppressed grief finally finding its release. I don't know how to stop, she gasped between sobs. I've been running the numbers for so long, I forgot they represent people. I turned people into percentages because percentages can't die on you. They can't disappoint you or leave you. Arthur, who had been waiting patiently at the house, must have sensed the profound shift in the car's atmosphere, the sudden rupture of Margaret's rigid composure. He appeared at the car window almost immediately, his face etched with concern, opening Margaret's door without a single word. She fell into his arms, utterly spent, like a child seeking refuge, this formidable woman who commanded boardrooms and controlled millions. It's time, ma'am, Arthur said gently, his voice a balm. It's time to remember who you were before the grief made you forget. That evening, Margaret called an emergency meeting of her board of directors. Samuel waited outside the imposing conference room, Grace quietly doing her homework beside him, listening to the raised, agitated voices within. When Margaret emerged 3 hours later, she looked utterly exhausted. But somehow, subtly, lighter. A profound weight lifted from her shoulders. I've halted the Wharf Street development, she announced, her voice firm, resolute. And I'm reviewing all our residential policies. It won't be popular. I might even lose the company. But you'll find yourself, Samuel countered, his voice quiet, but certain. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a small, sad, and exquisitely beautiful smile, as fragile and poignant as Grace's own heartfelt paintings. Maybe that's worth more than any empire, she whispered. The next weeks were a whirlwind of unprecedented change, a vibrant counterpoint to the mansion's previous silence. Margaret didn't just halt the evictions. She went to each displaced family personally, offering not just profound apologies, but tangible solutions, a genuine commitment to repair the damage. She converted the planned luxury development into desperately needed affordable housing, ensuring that the existing residents could remain in their homes. She hired local contractors for the extensive renovations, creating a surge of jobs and breathing new life into the very community she had almost destroyed. Samuel drove her to meetings that were profoundly different now, no longer with cold-eyed lawyers and calculating bankers, but with passionate community leaders, dedicated social workers, and empathetic teachers. Mrs.
Rodriguez, initially skeptical and wary, gradually transformed into one of Margaret's fiercest and most vocal advocates when she witnessed the genuine, transformative change. Mija, she told Margaret, using the Spanish endearment for daughter, her voice filled with warmth. We all lose our way. It's finding it again that matters.
Margaret, in a deeply personal act of healing, established the Whitmore Foundation, a compassionate program dedicated to addiction recovery and comprehensive family support services. The desolate, empty lot where Michael's house would have stood, a monument to her unaddressed grief, was transformed into a serene memorial garden, meticulously designed by local high school students. Their creative vision drew inspiration from the poignant architectural sketches found in Michael's old room, sketches that Margaret hadn't been able to bring herself to look at until now, symbols of shattered dreams now re-envisioned. Arthur watched all of this unfold with a quiet, knowing pride, occasionally catching Samuel's eye with a subtle nod that eloquently communicated, "This is who she used to be. This is the woman I always knew was beneath the sorrow." Grace, meanwhile, had blossomed into Margaret's unofficial art therapist. Her quiet wisdom and creative spirit, a balm to Margaret's healing soul. They worked together on intricate Kinugi projects, meticulously fixing broken items generously donated by the community. Each piece, once fractured and then meticulously repaired with shimmering gold, was lovingly auctioned to fund the new foundation, transforming brokenness into a tangible source of hope. Grace's artist statement for the nascent collection resonated with profound insight. Every crack tells a story. Every repair is an act of love. The Whitmore estate, once a formidable fortress against the world, its gates locked, its magnificent gardens maintained but never enjoyed, had stood in silent, imposing isolation for 3 long years. As December arrived, bringing the first soft, whispering snow of winter, Margaret stood in the grand main foyer, looking at the shrouded furniture, the closed-off rooms, vestiges of a life once lived, but now frozen in time. "This place is too big for one person," she murmured to Samuel and Arthur, a profound realization in her voice. Michael was right about that. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" Arthur asked, though his small, knowing smile suggested he already understood the beautiful direction of her thoughts. "A community garden. The grounds are certainly large enough. And the ballroom. It could be an after-school program space. Art classes for children like Grace." She turned to Samuel, her gaze earnest. Would people come? Samuel thought about the vibrant families in the Wharf Street neighborhood. The children with nowhere safe to play. The elderly with no gardens to tend. "They'd come," he affirmed, "but it can't feel like charity. It has to be theirs, too. Their space, their community." And so began the profound transformation, not just of the opulent estate, but of Margaret herself, a blossoming from within. She worked tirelessly alongside enthusiastic volunteers, her once manicured hands now comfortably deep in rich soil, planting delicate seedlings in the estate's vast greenhouse. She learned names, not of distant board members or powerful investors, but of laughing children, wise grandmothers, and struggling single parents, each face a testament to resilience.
The mansion's sprawling kitchen, once steeped in oppressive silence, now rang with the joyous laughter and enticing aromas of cooking classes, led with vibrant energy by Mrs. Rodriguez. Grace, with her quiet wisdom and artistic flair, painted a magnificent mural in what was swiftly becoming the community art room. It depicted a majestic tree, its sturdy trunk adorned with golden cracks, each branch gracefully holding a different family's unique story, a tapestry of interwoven lives. Margaret often stood before it, tracing the golden lines with her fingers, whispering what might have been prayers or profound apologies or fervent promises to her past and future self. The Wharf Street families, still wary, remained skeptical at first. Trust, once shattered, does not repair easily, even with the shimmering promise of gold.
But as winter deepened, casting longer shadows and bringing colder winds, they slowly, tentatively began to come. First, the children, drawn by Grace's enchanting art classes and the irresistible promise of warm, safe spaces to play. Then their parents, with hesitant steps, began tentatively joining the gardening planning committees, envisioning the vibrant growth of spring.
Finally, the elderly, lured by Arthur's comforting tea service and the quiet, understanding company of others who intimately understood loss, found solace within the mansion's walls. Samuel watched Margaret bloom in reverse, a remarkable metamorphosis from the frozen, distant woman he had first met in October to someone who now laughed freely when children tracked mud playfully through her once pristine marble foyer, a sign of vibrant life returning.
She learned Spanish curse words, with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, from the boisterous teenagers who held babies gently while their mothers attended vital job training workshops in what used to be the imposing formal dining room. The car rides, once somber rituals of grief, continued, but they were profoundly different now, infused with a new purpose and lightness. The hospital visits, once acts of self-punishment, became empowering meetings with addiction counselors. The law firm appointments were now dedicated to establishing robust nonprofit structures, building new foundations for hope. The empty lot, once a desolate reminder of Michael's lost dreams, was now a bustling building site. Not for Michael's house, but for a vibrant recovery center bearing his name, and the bank visits, once efficient but emotionally hollow, were now about securing vital microloans for burgeoning small businesses within the revitalized community. Spring arrived early that year, or perhaps it simply seemed that way because people, weary from winter's long embrace, were so utterly ready for it. The community gardens eagerly awaited opening day brought half of Mystic to the Whitmore estate. A joyous throng. Tents dotted the expansive grounds. Local bands played infectious melodies, and the tantalizing smell of grilled corn and sizzling hamburgers replaced the musty, pervasive silence that had haunted the property for so long. Samuel found Margaret standing alone by the tranquil memorial garden, her gaze fixed on Michael's profound sketch that had been meticulously etched into a stone monument. A simple house with large, welcoming windows and the poignant words, "Home is where healing happens," written in his own hand. "He would have been 30 this year," she said softly, her voice thick with bittersweet emotion. "He would have been proud," Samuel replied, a quiet, knowing certainty in his tone. Margaret shook her head gently. "I don't know about that, but maybe he would have understood that I finally learned what he tried to teach me, that buildings aren't homes, people are."
Grace, a burst of joyful energy, ran up to them, paint splattered on her clothes like vibrant constellations, her eyes bright with unbridled excitement. "Mrs. Whitmore, come see. We finished the mural in the greenhouse." Margaret allowed herself to be pulled along, her steps light, and Samuel followed, watching this remarkable woman who had once hired him to drive her through her grief, now being led by his daughter toward something that looked so genuinely like unadulterated joy.
The mural depicted the magnificent Whitmore mansion, but reimagined, its windows thrown open wide, golden light spilling out, the gardens brimming with people of all ages and colors, a vibrant tapestry of community. In the corner, Grace had painted 3 figures standing together. A tall woman with shimmering silver hair, a kind-eyed man, and a little girl carefully holding a golden, meticulously repaired bowl, a symbol of their shared journey.
"It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's us," Grace said simply, her young voice resonating with truth, but more golden. The foundation's first-year anniversary fell on an October day, so perfect it seemed almost staged, a day of crisp air and golden light. The estate grounds were hosting a vibrant harvest festival, with fresh produce from the thriving community garden being sold to fund the recovery center's crucial programs. Samuel watched from the grand main house steps as Grace, now full of chatter and confidence, helped younger children with their own Kanugi projects. Her grief hadn't disappeared, it never truly does, but it had transformed into something else entirely. Empathy, boundless creativity, a deep appreciation for the quiet, precious moments of beauty that life offered. Margaret stood beside him, no longer the distant stranger in the back seat, but something harder to define, something more profound.
Not family exactly, but not times family either. They had become to each other what Kanugi is to broken pottery. The shimmering gold that intricately holds the shattered pieces together, meticulously crafting something entirely new from the fragments of what was lost.
"I've been thinking," Margaret said, her gaze fixed on Arthur as he patiently taught a group of teenagers how to properly serve tea, a quiet smile playing on her lips. "About what you said that first month, Samuel, that we're all trying to control something in a world that proved we control nothing. I remember. I think you were wrong." She turned to him then, and her eyes, once the desolate color of grief, now held vibrant flecks of light, like sunlight catching on shattered glass.
We can't control loss, but we can control how we respond to it. We can choose to become harder or softer, to build walls or gardens, to create more broken things, or to learn how to repair them, to mend them with care. Mrs. Rodriguez, a radiant figure now, called out from the community garden where she was joyfully teaching a salsa dancing class amidst the flourishing tomato plants. "Margaret, Samuel, stop being so serious and come dance." Grace, with a spontaneous burst of childlike exuberance, grabbed their hands, pulling them irresistibly toward the infectious music. "Mom would have loved this," she exclaimed, her voice light with genuine happiness. And for the very first time, the mention of Laura's name brought radiant smiles instead of quiet, lingering tears. As Samuel allowed himself to be pulled into the lively dance, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar joy, he thought about that faded newspaper ad from a year ago, the job nobody wanted, at the house nobody visited. He thought about how the very worst, most devastating moments of their lives could sometimes, miraculously, lead to the best, if only one was brave enough to keep driving, relentlessly, through the darkest, most relentless storms. Margaret laughed, a sound of unadulterated joy, as Mrs. Rodriguez playfully corrected her footwork. The sound echoed across the vast grounds that had been steeped in profound silence for so long. The Whitmore estate was no longer a grim monument to grief. It had, in a beautiful, unexpected transformation, become what Michael had always dreamed of building. A vibrant home where profound healing truly happens, where broken things are painstakingly made beautiful, where the shimmering gold in the meticulously repaired cracks catches the radiant light and shows us, with undeniable clarity, that sometimes the repairs themselves are the most precious, most invaluable parts of all. That evening, as the harvest festival gently wound down and families headed home, their hands full with baskets of fresh vegetables and their hearts brimming with the warmth of newfound community, Samuel stood in the driveway where he used to wait with the Blacktown car. Margaret and Grace were sitting on the grand mansion steps, their heads bent together in quiet concentration over a new kanugi project, a delicate vase that would hold vibrant flowers for Michael's memorial garden. "Daddy," Grace called out, her voice bright and clear. "Margaret says we can stay for dinner. Arthur's making his special lasagna every Sunday," Margaret added, her voice imbued with a warmth that sounded less like a casual invitation and far more like a profound, unwavering promise. "If you'd like." Samuel thought about their small apartment, with its thin walls and persistently broken window. They still lived there. He had steadfastly refused Margaret's generous offers of financial help beyond his generous salary, but his apartment no longer felt like a suffocating prison. It felt like what it truly was: a starting point. Not a definitive ending. "We'd like that," Samuel said, his voice soft with emotion, walking toward them, toward this strange and exquisitely beautiful family, built not from blood or conventional ties, but from shared loss and shimmering gold, and the profound courage to keep repairing what was broken. As the sun, a fiery orb, set over Mystic, painting the vast sky in breathtaking shades of amber and rose, the Whitmore estate glowed with a warm, inviting light emanating from every single window. Inside, a little girl, her face alight with innocent joy, painted with vibrant watercolors, while a silver-haired woman, her heart now open, and a tired but no longer defeated man watched. Their silence, once oppressive, was now comfortable and profoundly full. Arthur, humming a soft, contented tune, worked in the kitchen, lovingly preparing food for the people he had grown to cherish. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Michael and Laura were perhaps watching too. They would know that their beloved ones had, against all odds, found a way to create extraordinary beauty from the ashes of breaking. The job nobody wanted had, indeed, become the absolute best decision of Samuel's life. Not because it had saved him financially, though it certainly had, but because it had taught him, with profound wisdom, that sometimes we have to drive through our deepest grief with an unexpected stranger before we can truly find our way home. And sometimes, if we are incredibly lucky, that stranger becomes the invaluable gold that intricately holds our broken pieces together, making us not merely whole again, but something infinitely better, cracked and lovingly repaired, and utterly precious in our beautiful imperfection.